Since its inception, the United States of America has been prone to the mistreatment of immigrants and minorities, with innumerable cases of discrimination in the nation's history, both socially and politically. This essay will shine light on two such occasions in our nation's history, one from around a century ago, and one that is still ongoing to this day. The striking similarities between the two cases showcases that this nation continues to take the same inhumane actions today as it did nearly 100 years ago. In the wake of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States initiated Executive Order 9066. This order allowed for the United States military to evacuate any citizens they deemed a threat to national security. This means hundreds of thousands of German American, Italian American, and especially Japanese American citizens were ousted from their homes and forced into relocation centers across the United States. This did not come out of nowhere, however. American xenophobia against Japanese in particular had been a mainstay of U.S. culture throughout the early 20th century. Anti-Japanese sentiment and legislation had been growing enormously up until the start of World War II. Over 110,000 Japanese were forced into these camps, where they lived communally until the end of the war, around 3 years later. Each of them were given only a few days to secure arrangements for their homes, businesses, and property. They were often forced to take enormous losses, and some even lost everything without any repayment whatsoever. Thousands of employed Japanese people lost their jobs, leading to an enormous labor shortage, especially in the agricultural field. When they were finally released in 1944, many of them struggled to re-enter the workforce due to racial prejudice and their situation allowing for employers to take advantage of them. 80 years later, we are seeing similar patterns to the Japanese internment in the treatment of immigrants who are detained at the United States-Mexican border. Since the 1980s, the United States has been incarcerating thousands of immigrants in shockingly similar fashion to the way the Japanese were. The conditions of these detention centers are similar, if not worse, than the conditions of those seen during World War II. The anti-immigration sentiment we see today rivals that of the anti-Japanese movement in the lead-up and creation of the Japanese internment camps. Conditions of Japanese internment camps were harsh. The camps were made up of hundreds of barracks, generally around 20 by 100 feet. Each of these buildings were split into 4 to 6 rooms. Each of these rooms held at least one family, sometimes two. Families had to share these rooms no matter how many members they had, so space was extremely limited. The rooms were dirty and sparsely furnished, as they had only been built in a matter of months. The rooms had no running water and were heated by coal-burning stoves, which often had no fuel. In order to get water, citizens had to go to the center of the camps, where the water was often of poor quality, leading to disease and other health issues. Generally, the only furnishings were cots and bedding. Most of the camps were located in desert areas, meaning temperatures could fluctuate from as low as negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit to as high as 115 degrees. Meals were provided at a scheduled time every day, which led to extremely long lines and wait times. Each person was allocated, on average, 45 cents per day, as the WRA was not permitted to spend more than what was available for the Army's rations, at 50 cents per day. Food shortages were common during this time, so meals often did not contain proteins and were generally unappetizing. After receiving public backlash claiming that the Japanese were receiving preferential treatment, the WRA was forced to send each month's planned menus to the capital in order to show that the Japanese internees were not being supplied with better food than the average American. Healthcare was also undeniably terrible. Hospitals often ran out of supplies and machinery, meaning the internees had to bring or make their own medical equipment. The hospitals were also extraordinarily understaffed, with some ratios being as low as 7 doctors to 10,000 patients. The poor medical conditions and compact space led to disease outbreaks, including chickenpox, malaria, typhoid, and tuberculosis. The structure of power in the camps also led to violence. Officers shot multiple innocent Japanese people, claiming they were attempting to leave the facilities. One of these victims was an elderly person who was killed immediately after being shot, and another a mentally disabled man. Officers were known to threaten and intimidate the internees, even though the crime rates in these communities were only a third of that in the rest of America. The border camps seen today are no better, if not worse, than the conditions seen in the Japanese internment. These centers are often extremely crowded and filthy, which has led to several outbreaks of diseases such as COVID-19, as well as other health issues like lice. There are numerous reports of insect infestations, as well as deteriorating facilities that are improperly cleaned, including showers, kitchens, and medical centers. Medical equipment is often dirty and in a general state of disrepair. and general medical care is lackluster, if not negligent. Several reports have come forth of doctors outright leaving conditions untreated, such as hypothyroidism and diabetes. Other doctors even withheld information, such as failing to tell a patient that they had tested positive for HIV. Some are even left with open wounds after going through surgery and are sent back to live with the rest of the detainees with untreated, open surgery wounds. Staff members are often reported to be extremely rude, yelling and harassing detainees, as well as often using excessive force. This includes tasing incarcerees until they fall unconscious, pepper spraying and restraining detainees, and even one case of ripping off a hospitalized detainee's IV. Often, this excessive force is in response to mental health crises, including threats of self-harm. An even more common punishment than excessive force is solitary confinement, where individuals will be locked into isolated rooms for anywhere from a few days to several years. This treatment often leads to severe mental health issues and worsens the conditions of those who already have poor mental health conditions. Some women report that guards would tell them that they would be put on suicide watch for crying, and that they weren't allowed to cry. Families are often separated, leaving children to fend for themselves, often being placed into migrant children camps after their parents are deported. While familial separation did occur during the Japanese internment, it was uncommon. Today, over 12,000 children are living in these camps, separated from their families. Sexual violence was commonplace in internment camps, where Japanese women were raped and assaulted not only by other internees, but also, if not more often, by white guards and armed soldiers. These crimes are often erased from official records, and most evidence we have gathered around these crimes are through the writings of other internees. Oftentimes, victims were subject not only to their assaults, but were then accused of sexual crimes themselves, as the War Relocation Authority charged citizens for actions like premarital sex and adultery, which were often charged against victims of rape. When women would come forward, the men involved faced little consequence due to poor handling of assault trials by camp authorities, and were often only transferred to a different camp. The culture within the camps also supported this sort of rape culture. Those within the camps were unlikely to discuss the issues of rape and sexual assault, and generally stayed silent about the issue, even though they knew about specific crimes happening. As such, it is more than likely that there was significantly more rape and assault in the camps than is officially or non-officially reported, due to the stigma surrounding reporting sexual crimes. In detention centers across the nation, the story is no different. In the last decade, over 300 immigrants detained in these centers have filed complaints regarding sexual assault and abuse. These 300 cases likely only scratch the surface of sexual violence in the camps, as ICE seldom reveals any data on complaints such as these. These assaults are often committed by staff members working in these facilities, including nurses and guards. Much like the Japanese internment cases, these crimes are often overlooked and mismanaged. Of the 308 cases reported, only around 40% were investigated to any extent. Of the cases investigated, very few result in any sort of action taken, as most are ruled to be unsubstantiated. The unaccompanied children in these camps are potentially at greatest risk. More than 100 reports have been filed regarding employees of detention centers assaulting, raping, and soliciting sex from unaccompanied minors. One 8-year-old victim came forth and said her assaulter, an employee at one of the migrant children facilities, repeatedly entered their bedrooms in the middle of the night to touch their private area, and he threatened to kill their families if they disclosed the abuse. The internees at internment camps were forced into doing labor for the United States for pennies on the dollar. At one camouflage netting factory, they were paid as little as $8 a month. Farm workers made a measly $12 a month, a quarter of the average salary at the time. At Tool Lake, one of the most infamous camps, men who refused to work could be fined $20 a month, more than most were even earning in the camps at the time. Conditions were poor and dangerous, with one reported transportation accident injuring 30 workers and killing one. When the workers went on strike in response to this accident, the government brought in strikebreakers, who were paid up to 15 times more than the laborers. Some young Japanese Americans were released around 1943, where they were told they were allowed to leave so long as they found work outside of the exclusion zones. Essentially, this meant that all the Japanese who were living and working on the West Coast were forced to relocate east in cities like Chicago and New York. When the Japanese were finally released, they struggled to find work, were not trusted by their co-workers and deemed as the enemy, and were often taken advantage of by employers who knew they had very little leverage due to the widespread mistrust. Many of the camps at the borders are privatized, meaning they are run by a corporation and make money off of the incarceration of immigrants. These detention centers are often inside private prisons, where several major private detention centers have been accused of forcing their incarcerees into labor, paying them cents per hour, only amounting to around $1 a day. These detained immigrants have the right to refuse to work, as well as a right to any and all safety requirements that would be existent in a normal workplace. However, these companies regularly ignore these rights. Detainees state that guards would often pressure them into doing labor, threatening to put them into solitary confinement, lose basic necessities, and restrict the right to call their families. Often, these workers are forced to work 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. Some even claim to have been forced to work even when they were sick. Amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, incarcerated workers were verbally threatened and forced to work without any protective gear, which led to a boom in COVID cases, including some deaths as a result of the disease. These companies make enormous profits off of forced labor and unfair wages. The largest private incarceration company made over $1.6 billion a year from labor amidst the Trump administration. The Japanese internment did not come out of nowhere. Leading up to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was an extraordinary amount of anti-Asian sentiment, especially anti-Japanese and anti-Chinese, due to the large influx of Japanese and Chinese immigrants in the latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Foreign-born American Asians were denied naturalization and as such could not become U.S. citizens, leading to further exclusion from American society. In 1902, a bill was passed barring further immigration from China, which was amended in 1907 to additionally bar Japanese people from immigrating as well. These bans remained in place until 1943 and 1965, respectively. Political rallying became the biggest push against the Japanese, as hundreds of anti-Japanese groups propped up in the early 1900s, especially in western states like California and Hawaii. This coalition, aptly named the Japanese Exclusion League, was a major political force at this time, pushing for anti-Asian legislation such as segregating schools, permanently denying citizenship to Asians, and prohibiting any further immigration from Japan. In 1920, these groups succeeded in penning a law that denied Japanese from owning, purchasing, and even leasing land. The law also meant that Japanese parents could no longer act as guardians to their own children, as immigrant parents were no longer to do so if their children were American citizens. Latino discrimination has existed in America for decades, at least since the U.S.'s victory in the Mexican-American War, and incarceration of immigrants has a history dating back to 1892 with the opening of the Ellis Island Immigration Station. In 1893, the first law that required the detention of illegal immigrants was passed. In 1905, the U.S. began its Southern Border Patrol, which was officially formed in 1924. However, it wasn't until the 1980s that incarceration began to ramp up to levels that we see today. Under the Reagan administration, due to the large influx of Cuban, Haitian, and Central American immigrants, drastic measures were taken in order to curb the large numbers of Latin Americans arriving in the country. In 1983, the administration declared that at any time, 10,000 spaces must be available at any given time for immigrant detention. That same year, the first private detention company was created. This company would go on to initiate the detention of children and infants. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, anti-Mexican sentiment continually rose, with sentiment towards immigration veering more and more negative in the wake of the September 11th attacks. Sentiment has become even more negative in the last several election cycles. In the last 5 years, racially motivated hate crimes have increased nearly 50%. Hispanic and Latino people state that they don't feel safe even going out to the store, doing everyday things like taking their kids to school, going to buy food, just walking in the street. These crimes have increased in large part due to the political rhetoric espoused by politicians and extensive news coverage negatively depicting Hispanic and Latino people, just as we saw how Japanese incarceration was spurred on by the enormous amount of anti-Japanese coverage in the early 1900s. Looking at these two cases reveals a shocking amount of similarities between the two. In both cases, people were stripped of their rights and forced into poor living conditions, where they were tormented and harassed by authority structures within the camps. In both cases, violence and sexual abuse was commonplace, and the incarcerees were forced into low-paying manual labor and were punished if they refused. In both cases, the reaction of the American people is ultimately what led to their unfair treatment and incarceration. It is important to recognize these similarities, as knowing our nation's history allows us to prevent it from repeating itself. By knowing America's history of detention and mistreatment, by recognizing the rhetoric being used, and by being aware of the way the American population reacts to these groups, we are able to speak out about the travesties taking place in our country and help prevent this egregious treatment from getting worse.